to another one of our crops winter webinars today. Today our topic, we're going to be talking about homegrown research, so learning the latest from the Agri-ARM research sites in your backyard. My name is Ali Noble and I am the Crops Extension Specialist with the Ministry of Agriculture out of the Prince Albert Regional Office, and I'll be chairing today's event. CEUs are being offered for CCAs on this webinar. In order to get the credit, you'll have to attend the whole webinar, and we'll be sharing the QR code at the end of the presentations this morning. If you do miss the code and have attended live, just please email us afterwards and we'll work to get you your credit. Before we start the presentation here this morning, I'm just going to go through a couple items we have to share. So of course, our theme this morning is Agri-ARM sites. Agri-ARM is a network of producer-directed applied research and demonstration organizations located throughout Saskatchewan. So these are going to have speakers from each of these sites discussing research projects that are done locally for producers to base their practices off of. You can find out more about each of the sites through the following QR code. The sites are in several different regions throughout the province in order to get the best snapshot of different growing season lengths and different soil types as well. Many projects are run at multiple sites to capture data that showcases a variety of different regions. Oh, sorry guys, just a minor issue with screen sharing here. Alrighty. So as I said, you can go through the QR code on this slide to find some more information. We'll also be sharing these afterwards, so you can look through it after as well. Next up is just on the Agri-ARM website, you can actually find upcoming events, current projects, fact sheets, and research updates. So feel free to check this out for more information, especially regarding the site that's most local to you. As we go into the growing season, each year, each site holds a field day so local agronomists and producers can come check out the projects mid-season. You can check out the upcoming dates on the map here. Our Crops Extension Specialist teams put on the webinar series each year. We work out of 10 different offices throughout the province. Each office contains a wide variety of specialists that can help you with any agriculture-based question. You can check out the map on the screen. To connect with our specialists, please just call your local regional office or the Ag Knowledge Center at the number provided. If you've ever heard the words on the radio, Saskatchewan is 98% completed harvest this week, then you had likely heard of the crop report. Our colleagues in the Moose Jaw office write the crop report each week during the growing season based on data collected from crop reporters throughout the province. I'd like to thank all of our current crop reporters for helping us achieve this comprehensive report throughout the growing season. I know it's relied on by many people. And I'd also like to invite any new crop reporters to sign up. You can just use the QR located on the screen to actually sign up. One of the many ways we work with the Agri-ARM sites throughout the province is through Crop Diagnostic School. Crop Diagnostic School is going to be held in Scott, Saskatchewan this year on July 23rd and 24th. So more details are going to be coming soon, but just save that date if you're interested in coming. And lastly, we just want to make sure that everybody is aware of the funding available through the Sustainable Canadian Agricultural Partnership. You can reach out to our local regional offices to work with an agriculture program specialist to find out what funding you may qualify for. So with that, we're about to get into our first presentation here, but along with this information, we have some additional resources for everybody under our handout sections in the chat box area of the toolbar on the webinar. These will be shared with the recording after the webinar is complete in an email to anybody who is registered. Today's presentations are going to be followed with a live Q&A for each speaker. The main hub for today will be your webinar screen, and as mentioned, we will share relevant downloadable handouts with you in the chat box area. The entire session will be recorded, so if you miss anything or wish to revisit any of the presentations, you'll be able to afterwards. Recording links will be sent out later this week in a follow-up email. An evaluation is going to pop up at the end of the webinar this morning, so please ensure that you fill that out, as we really rely on these to find out what topics you guys want to learn about in the coming webinars, and it helps us prioritize any research needs for the future as well. We have a few housekeeping notes to keep in mind during the webinar. If anyone has any questions during any of the presentations, you can type them into the question box on the top right-hand side of your control panel. We will try to get to as many of the questions as possible, and your questions will remain anonymous and only sent to me. During the presentation, you will be muted so that we can ensure there is no feedback that would interfere with our audio. So with that, we're going to get started on our first presentation here. So I'm going to invite Mike Hall from the East Central Research Foundation, which is the Agri-ARM site located near Yorkton. You can begin whenever you're ready there, Mike. You're just on mute, Mike, and we can't see your presentation there yet. Oh, presentation's up, and you're still on mute there.
Okay, that should be better then.
Yes, we can hear you now. And then do you just want to pull your presentation back up there?
Okay. All good?
Yes, everything looks good.
Okay. All right, thank you. Yeah, I'm Mike Hall, and I've been at the Yorkton Research Farm since 2013. And it's a collaborative effort between the East Central Research Foundation and Suncrest College. And we've conducted a number of cereal intercrop trials, and in these trials, we'll seed a spring forage cereal like CDC Haymaker Oats, which is a forage variety, or Maverick Barley, which is another forage variety, and companion crop it with a winter cereal like Fridge Winter Triticale or Italian Ryegrass. So this enables us to harvest some decent quantities of green feed and leave the winter cereal below to continue growing after that harvest to provide us with some ground cover and some fall grazing. So, like I said, the winter cereal keeps the ground covered, which is good for the soil. And the fall grazing of that winter cereal can take some of the pressure off of perennial forage stands, allowing them to build up their energy reserves prior to winter so that they survive the winter better. Winter triticale has the potential also to overwinter and provide some early spring grazing should you desire. If you do not desire, you could try Italian ryegrass instead, because Italian ryegrass does not overwinter in our climate. So this is a plus or minus depending upon your preference. So the study that I'm going to be covering today was conducted in Yorkton at one site. And here we are looking at the treatment list. So we're looking at the performance of these intercrops as I've just described, but we're looking at them when we seed them early on May 9th versus late on June 3rd. We've not done this seeding date comparison before, but it was anticipated that the barley should perform worse when we're seeding late compared to the oats due to its photosensitivity. And the reason I say this is because of work that was done by Barron et al. In 2012 that found forage yields of barley and oats were quite comparable when they were seeded early, in this case May 10th. But as seeding date was delayed, the yield of barley declined linearly, which is highlighted here in yellow. In contrast, the oats actually increased for a little while before starting to decline, once we get to later June. So this is supposedly occurring because barley is more photosensitive than oats. Barley is purported to shorten its vegetative period when seeding is delayed, and in turn this can reduce its yield potential. Now, let's see if we actually observe this phenomenon. And spoiler alert, no, we didn't. We actually observed the opposite. And however, I think I have a reason why we observed the opposite, and I'll get to that eventually. Um, so here we have the green feed yield of haymaker oats in blue as the monocrop was drastically reduced when seeding late, and quite significantly so. I think that's a 42% yield decline. In contrast, the barley did not decrease as we seeded it late here in orange. So this is contrary to the work by Barron et al. And the reason for this isn't totally clear. Maverick is not day length insensitive, so environmental conditions were just likely better for the late seeded barley. Rainfall during June was above average, for example. But why the poor performance of the haymaker oats then? We're looking at a yield reduction of 42%. And I think it's possible that excessive lodging actually has played the role when we were seeding the oats late. My lodging ratings don't go all the way up to the time of when we harvest it, but I'll show you some pictures that basically tell me that the lodging was more severe for the late seeded oats than it was for the early seeded oats at the time of harvest. I'll cover the lodging ratings that I do have, and then I'll point to that evidence. So by July 12th, no lodging had started for the late seeded crop, which is treatments 7 to 12 here on the right hand side of the figure. Hence, there's no lodging ratings there for them. But for the early seeded stuff, treatments 1 to 6, lodging was quite heavy for the monocrop oats here in blue and the monocrop barley here in orange. However, when we intercrop the oats with either winter triticale or Italian ryegrass, we significantly reduce the amount of lodging that occurred. But that effect was not really observed with intercropping with the barley. That is until we got to July 25th. By July 25th, the level of lodging had worsened for the monocrop barley in orange relative to the monocrop oats in blue. But now a significant reduction in lodging could also be detected for both the oats and the barley when intercropping with the winter cereal. I've seen this same phenomenon occur with oats for milling, for grain production, in another experiment that we conducted last year as well. To give you a visual feel for the lodging ratings, here are some representative pictures. Here we have monocrop oats, which is suffering more severe lodging than oats that are being intercropped. So here's monocropped oats. And then when we intercropped it with winter triticale, you can see it standing up quite a bit better. And also when we intercrop with Italian ryegrass. Here's the monocrop barley, which is lodged fairly well, at the back, if you look to the back of the plot in particular there. And then intercropping it with winter triticale, it's standing up better, and to a lesser degree with the Italian ryegrass. So the question is, why does intercropping reduce lodging in barley and oats? And two, two reasons come to mind. One, the spring cereal is being seeded at a 3/4 rate, which reduces competition between the intercrop competition with the cereals and can lead to thicker stems and probably reduce lodging. So that could be part of it. But also, competition with the winter cereal may have more effectively lowered the amount of available nitrogen to that spring cereal. And low nitrogen lowers the incidence of lodging. And this hypothesis is further backed up by our milling oat trial that we conducted in that same year. Because when we conducted that intercrop, we found that the intercrop reduced lodging, it hastened maturity, it decreased protein, it increased test weight, and all of those are known to occur when you're reducing nitrogen in the system. So the question that remains unanswered is why oats perform so poorly when seeded late. And like I said, while I don't have late season lodging ratings, I can still infer the lodging was pretty severe for that late seeded oats at the time we uh, we were harvesting, based on pictures that I took on October 2nd. So by October 2nd, there's clearly more. If you're looking at the dry straw color, trash here, there's clearly more debris left behind after green feed harvest for the late seeded plots of the oats on the bottom row of plots here compared to the early seeded plots on the top row. So at the time of harvest, lodging was severe enough that it was impeding the ability of a forage harvester to adequately pick up every last straw. So effectively, there's been more debris left behind because of the severe lodging that occurred with the late seeded oats. You don't see this effect with the barley. We don't have much straw left behind with the barley plots. Um, it appears to be minimal and similar between plots between the early on the top row here versus late on the bottom row. So in conclusion, when seeded late, the yield performance of oats declined more relative to barley because lodging hampered the efficient harvest of oats to a greater degree than it did for the barley. At least in part, this explains why there was a poorer yield performance of oats relative to barley when seeded late instead as anticipated. Barley and oat breeder Brian Rossnagel points out that average oat varieties are tall with much longer and larger leaves, which can lead to lodging. And also that later seeding date can lead to weaker plants because the initial growth stages are proceeding very quickly through the longer days and warmer temperatures that are associated with the later seeding date. As an interesting aside, in another experiment we conducted in 2022, we found Maverick barley was actually lodging more than the haymaker oats in this case. So this just goes to show you that lodging is a pretty complicated process, and there's obviously a number of factors that influence the degree to which a species is going to lodge. Continuing on with seed yields for the intercrops, we can see here whether seeded early or late, intercropping Italian ryegrass with either haymaker oats or maverick barley tended to increase green feed yield, but none of these effects were significant. Intercropping with fridge winter triticale tended to reduce green feed yield. While these effects were insignificant, we've seen this pattern in a multiple of trials. Italian ryegrass is clearly less competitive against the spring cereal than the winter triticale. And this is true whether we've been looking at green feed yields in the past or milling yields like I was describing earlier with oats. Crude protein for the intercrops with oats was numerically lower compared to the monocrop. It's interesting that this occurred because, the green feed is also including the immature winter cereal, which you would assume would have a better feed quality because of its immature state. Crude protein for the intercrops with barley was also frequently lower compared to the monocrop. And the only exception to this was barley plus winter triticale when seeded early for some reason. Total digestible nutrients for the intercrops with oats was numerically lower compared to the monocrop. TDN for the intercrops with barley was also frequently lower compared to the monocrop. The only exception to this was barley plus winter triticale. All the protein and TDN values here have to be taken with a grain of salt because they're based on bulk samples across reps. In other words, there's no statistics here. Having a lower green feed protein and TDN for intercrops relative to the monocrop doesn't make intuitive sense. Having the inclusion of a vegetative winter cereal should be improving the feed quality. Perhaps the poorer feed quality is related to differences in lodging. You know, lodging was more severe for the monocrops at a here, which I think probably was keeping the spring cereal in a more immature vegetative state compared to the spring cereals that were in intercrops. And perhaps this is the reason for the slightly better feed quality that was associated with the monocrop. Here we have grazing yields of winter cereal regrowth taken on October 8. Grazing yields for the fridge winter triticale in green tended to be higher compared to the Italian ryegrass in blue. Differences were statistically significant for the late seeded forage. Um, and we've seen this with other trials as well, with the triticale being higher yielding than the Italian ryegrass. In our 2022 study, our research also found grazing yields here in orange were significantly higher for the winter triticale compared to the Italian ryegrass. I've only seen one trial, and that was in redverse, where grazing yield was higher for Italian ryegrass compared to the winter triticale. It's usually the other way around. In our current study, grazing yields after barley was harvested for green feed tended to be higher because barley comes off earlier than oats, which provides more time for the regrowth of the winter cereal. Moreover, there's less lodging with barley. Lodging is hard on the winter cereal. This effect was statistically significant for the Italian ryegrass intercrop when seeded late. To give you a visual impression of the regrowth for grazing by October 2nd, these pictures represent the best regrowth of the winter triticale above and the Italian ryegrass below, which was associated with early seeded barley, which came off the earliest. And in contrast, here's the poorest regrowth of the winter triticale above and the Italian ryegrass below. These plots are associated with late seeded oats, where lodging was intense and had provided you the least amount of time available for fall regrowth. Turning to the feed quality, crude protein levels tended to be higher for the winter triticale regrowth compared to the Italian ryegrass for both the early and late seeding dates. However, the total digestible nutrients tended to be higher for the Italian ryegrass, but this trend wasn't totally consistent. Putting it all together, here's what we have. We have green feed yields combined with grazing yields for winter triticale in green and the Italian ryegrass in blue. First thing to notice is intercropping always increased total seasonal forage production relative to the monocrop. However, intercropping with Italian ryegrass tended to increase total dry matter yield relative to intercropping with fridge winter triticale, despite Italian ryegrass providing lower grazing yields. This was because intercropping with Italian ryegrass didn't decrease green feed yields as much as intercropping with fridge winter triticale. Italian ryegrass appears to be less competitive with its spring cereal nurse crop. Certainly seen that in other trials. Here's looking back at our 2022 study again, and there's many similarities here. Intercropping with winter triticale reduced spring cereal yield, but provided more grazing yield compared to Italian ryegrass. However, intercropping with Italian ryegrass produced greater total forage yields because it didn't reduce the green feed yield as much. So if I want to draw some conclusions over this particular study anyway, the cereal, intercropping a spring cereal with a winter cereal is a great way to provide some fall grazing. Winter triticale will be more competitive with the spring cereal than the Italian ryegrass, potentially lowering the green feed yield, but providing more fall grazing. Intercropping with early seeded barley could provide the greatest amount of fall grazing, and intercropping with late seeded oats will likely provide the lowest amount of fall grazing. Intercropping had the added benefit of reducing lodging, mostly probably because of taking nitrogen out of the system for the main cereal crop. Lodging may have caused some unusual results in this study, such as oats losing a relatively more yield when seeded late compared to the barley, and monocrops were having better feed quality relative to the intercrops, probably because the lodging is keeping it in sort of a greener condition. So thanks to Sustainable Cap for funding this project, and I can take questions if there are any at this time.
Awesome. Thank you for the presentation there, Mike. So one of the questions I have for you is just when producers are actually looking at the logistics of, okay, we can get some more forage production out of using a companion crop here. What logistics do they need to keep in mind? So you mentioned a bit about like fertilizer and that kind of thing. Is there any other management throughout the growing season that might be affected or a little different than when they're just monocropping?
Uh, Logistics wise, you know, I, I guess, it depends what time of year you're seeding it. And, as you're seeding late, you're kind of balancing this grazing, how much grazing yield do you want? And then barley and oats, whether you select that is going to affect how much you get for grazing. Um, the the winter cereal, triticale, like I said with our milling oat study, it was really competitive, against the oats, and even the forage oat that we had in another study was really competitive. So, if the green feed is the yield that you really want the most out of, I'm kind of liking the Italian ryegrass side of things because it's less competitive with the crop. You still get your good high green feed yields, and you still get some fall grazing out of that, and I often got more total production. Uh, the other thing about the Italian ryegrass, if you don't want to be bothered with trying to take it out of production the following spring, you don't have to because the winter took care of it. So logistically, you don't have to be spraying it out like you would have to with winter cereals or winter triticale. Um, we typically put the seeding rate down 3/4 for the spring cereal in there. But as far as problems logistically for the combination of the two, I can't think of any, real big issues. So I guess it's been, you putting cattle out there, and so they're spreading manure out there, so that's good for the soil. But I've also heard from farmers complain about that. Wow, if they're going out there in wet conditions, they can cause quite a bit of compaction with their hooves and stuff like that too. So I guess that's a consideration that we never ever look at in our trials. Um, yeah, sorry, I don't know if I've sort of really got at the answer that they were looking for, but
No,
I
I
can't
think you
think of
touched
any
on a
big.
couple items to keep in mind there. And then just another question too is with producers when we're looking at like forage varieties of oats and barley, do you think there's anything? Oftentimes, there's a lot of older varieties that I think are relied on. Do you think there's any newer varieties that, especially in the barley realm, that producers maybe should start considering?
Well, in this one we have Maverick, which is um, is a forage variety, and it has reduced ons, the sort of thing, from, I think it was bred out of Cowboy, because Maverick is one smooth cowboy. I think that's how you're supposed to remember it. And so it's probably the better variety to go in terms of the silage green feed thing, to have less mouth sores and that sort of thing. Um, so yeah, I would say that, forage wise, Maverick is probably the one that I see everyone playing around with. It's probably the way to go.
Awesome. Thank you, Mike. Alrighty. So with that, thank you, Mike, for joining us for the presentation. Again, he's based out of the ECRF, which is in Yorkton, or right around Yorkton there. Uh, our next speaker that we're going to have joining us is Lana Shaw from the Southeast Research Farm, which is located near Redver, Saskatchewan. And Lana is going to be talking about some intercropping projects. I'm also hoping she mentions her chickens as well.
Chickens. Wasn't
They
planning
might.
to talk about the chicken.
That's fair. It looks like your internet's a little slow there, Lana. So maybe if you just turn off your camera, we'll just get your mic.
I can't hear any answers. Okay,
We can see everything looks good
do
here.
we want the camera on? It says poor connection.
Yeah, I'd keep your camera off for now.
Okay, I'll leave the camera off just in case that's making a difference. Because I seem to be having a little difficulty. Thank you for having me. This is one of my, but I was leading. It's the first field season was in 2019. No field season ended up being in 2023, I believe, by COVID. So we've finally got.
Hi, Lana. I'm not sure if you can
So this
hear.
is the full title. I didn't put that on the slide because it's a bit long.
I don't know if Lana can hear me, but we're
Is it? Are
just
we not
having
coming
issues.
through?
No, it looks like your connection's breaking up a bit. Is there any other, do you have like a hard line you could attach to? If not, we can just do
Um,
a quick switch to Chris instead, and then have you follow up after if we can get you connected to some better internet.
okay.
Alrighty, Chris, are you around?
You betcha. Ready to go anytime. I'll pop up my coffee, but my PowerPoint's open and I'm good to go.
Awesome. We will switch it over to you then, Chris, and
Okay.
we will hopefully get Lana connected afterwards here. So with that, there we go. We can see your PowerPoint. Chris Hosapple is from the Indian Head Agricultural Research Foundation, which is located near Indian Head, Saskatchewan. And today he's going to be talking to us about plant growth regulators. So we will let you take it away there, Chris.
Okay. I lost my power or my presenter's view. Just give me half a second here. But yeah, I guess just, well, I'm getting going. Here we are. I have the view I want. I was just going to give a kind of a good rundown on a single adopt project that we did. We did this with funding from the ministry, but kind of it was set up through Sask Barley. They were the ones who wanted to get it off the ground, and I thought it was a neat project and fit well into our 20-minute time slot. So that's what we're going with. It was actually a year where we had some lodging. So just a little bit of background here. I'll go through it pretty quickly, but I'm sure everyone knows what PGRs are. But we have two major classes I guess in Western Canada. There's the ethylene releasing agents, which aren't really going to be the focus of today at all, but that's ethrel, and then our gibberellin inhibitors, which I think most of us would have more experience with, and that is manipulator and modus. The availability and adoption of these products in Western Canada has been fairly recent. Ethrel has actually been available in Western Canada for decades, but really only for seed growers, as the label doesn't include barley, and kind of a finicky product to use. Manipulator kind of first came about in 2014 in Western Canada, but that was just for wheat. In 2020 is when that label got expanded to include oats and barley. And then Modus really kind of came on board in 2020 for pretty much all crops, I think, at that time, wheat and barley for sure, but that was available at the same time as manipulator to barley growers specifically. Just a good, I think if anybody's interested in a bit of a deeper dive, this is a really relevant and fairly recent paper that was published out of Alberta, but we even had sites in Indian Head and in Saskatchewan, but looking at a bunch of management factors, but kind of a focus on barley for or on barley with PGRs, sorry, on PGRs with barley, excuse me. But just some of the basic findings that they had, they found that Ethrel and Modus were both fairly effective at reducing height, maybe Ethrel a little bit better. Manipulator was not. They didn't have much success with that product. When it came to lodging, Modus was their most effective product, Ethrel kind of intermediate, Manipulator inconsistent. So sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. None of the products affected yield or protein in that particular study. Lodging was fairly minor, I guess, but I guess since PGRs came on to barley growers, we've had a pretty good stretch of dry weather, hot in some cases, and we've had certainly some growers, I think, who used it expressed some concerns about the safety of it, maybe seeing some burning in a few cases, or a common kind of observation was the head not fully emerging from the boot. So some concerns there from growers. And I guess, this is more anecdotal, but in Europe, growers have actually been tank mixing Modus and Manipulator. They work on similar or different places in the kind of gibberellin synthesis pathway, I guess. So there can be some synergies using them together. And they felt maybe in addition to improving efficacy, they were getting some improvements in crop safety. And there's been a little bit of work with this, nothing published to my knowledge, but a little bit with wheat actually that has shown some promise as well, just this PGR mixing. So coming to our trial specifically, just our broader objectives were really to demonstrate responses of three newer up and coming malting varieties to the PGR options, either manipulator or chlormaclot chloride, CC, you'll often see it referred to at in my slides, or Modus, which is trinexapac ethyl, and that'll be kind of TE you'll see in some of our slides. Applied either on their own, as most growers would, or in combination, which is kind of one of the things we were exploring. We ran this at Indian Head, Prince Albert, Scott, and Outlook. Kind of tried to focus more on the locations that maybe we had a bit of a better chance of seeing some lodging and were more likely to utilize these products. Our treatments were pretty big tests, actually 21 of them in total. So on the PGR side of things, we had 7 of them, either full rates of Modus or Manipulator, half rates of both those products, which probably didn't really need, but kind of wanted to just test for some synergies there. And then we get down into the mixes. So either a 0.5x mix, we took a half rate of both Manipulator and Modus of the barley rate, put those in a tank mix and applied them, or a full rate tank mix, which is basically taking the full rate of each of those products and applying them together. So that one's getting pretty expensive, and I think we'll see fairly hot. Also an untreated control, of course, we got to have that. For varieties, we use Synergy, Fraser, and Connect. Synergy is, I think, probably currently the dominant variety out there, reasonably new, but been around for a while and has seen good uptake. Fraser and Connect we kind of see as some up and comers that are gaining ground and might be pretty important in the future. So we wanted to get some data on them. Data collection, looked at a whole bunch of stuff. So emergence, just kind of for background info, not going to talk about it, the untreated check only. Some phyto ratings, which didn't see much interesting there either, so not going to present. And then plant height, lodging, yield, and several different quality parameters is what we looked at for data collection. Now we'll just kind of roll through, I think, some of that, and hopefully things are presented in a manner that you can grasp it pretty quickly. And I guess as a side note, these presentations will be available. And I've also got the full report here as supplementary info. But this is height data from Indian Head. So we do see some variety effects. Not something that I'm going to focus on today, but they are presented and they were significant. But when we looked at the PGR effects, we can see, of course, our untreated control is the tallest. Half rate of manipulator didn't reduce height significantly or really at all, and everything else did. The full rate of full rate of Modus is over here. Full rate of manipulator worked quite well, but maybe not quite to the extent of Modus. You get into these mixes, and we do see some synergies in Indian Head, especially this 1X mix here was astoundingly short. Anyone at our field day, could certainly pick that one out pretty easily. Looking at the results from Outlook here, I should mention I do present some statistics over in the side. We didn't have any interactions at Indian Head, which tells us that the PGR responses were consistent across varieties. At Outlook, we did have that interaction, but this is just our main effects here, where you can see things kind of look similar to what we saw at Indian Head, except Manipulator didn't work as well, I guess. It really didn't work at all for reducing height, and we didn't necessarily see the advantage to the tank mixes over Modus alone. Really, our interactions, I think, basically just showed that I think Connect over here on the far right was less responsive than some of the other varieties, but for the most part, things were reasonably consistent. Looking at moving on to, I guess, Prince Albert, our heights were shorter, or plants, sorry, were shorter overall. This y-axis does move a little bit here just to show the differences. And really only two treatments significantly reduced height relative to the control at Prince Albert. One of those was our full rate of Modus, so again, looking pretty good. And then, of course, that full rate tank mix was pretty much comparable to the full rate Modus. All the other treatments didn't significantly reduce height, and no interactions tells us that that was consistent across varieties. Moving on to Scott, we see, I guess, some patterns emerging here where once again, our control is the tallest. Manipulator, again, really wasn't that effective. At the full rate, we have a significant reduction, but it's very small. Full rate Modus worked quite well. Half rate, not as well, but better than Manipulator. We look at our full rate tank mix, and once again, that stands out as being incredibly short. And our half rate tank mix, really basically just about the same as going with Modus on its own. No real benefit to that. And again, this was consistent across varieties. This is just kind of a nice little visual, I guess. So it's all things that I've more or less already talked about, but we can see that we do have some kind of patterns where things are pretty consistent across sites, other than some subtle differences and maybe shorter plants overall at Prince Albert. But I just thought that's a nice visual to kind of look at everything together. When it came to lodging, I guess I'll just start by saying we only saw any lodging whatsoever at Indian Head and Scott. Prince Albert didn't observe any lodging. They did the ratings, but everything was a 1. Everything was standing up straight. You'll recall that those was also the shortest plants, and Outlook missed these measurements here, so we don't have that data. Indian Head was quite interesting, though. This was by far the worst lodging I've seen in better part of a decade, probably going back to about 2016. We have been on a bit of a dry stretch, but I think one of the things that happened at Indian Head is we had cool, wet weather for the first half of the season. Things did get dry, which hurt our yield potential, but we still had all that vegetation. And then once August came around, kind of late July, we started getting winds and thunderstorms and some not so nice harvest conditions, which tended to bring the crop down. So I guess looking at varieties, we should mention that Synergy is by far the worst lodging, at least under the conditions that we saw. But the other two varieties were better, but still did lodge. This is a scale of 1 to 9. Looking at our PGR effects, we had that interaction, but for the most part, almost all the treatments except that half rate of Manipulator did improve the situation with lodging. Full rate of Modus was really quite effective. Manipulator, not as much, but it was an improvement. The half rate tank mix, I guess, wasn't an improvement over Modus. Still worked really well, but just wasn't any better than Modus on its own. And numerically, at least, we do see the biggest reduction in lodging, essentially no lodging at all in that full rate tank mix. But again, that does get pretty expensive. We did have some interactions here, but I think for the most part, this was just showing a lot more separation with Synergy, which was by far our variety that lodged the most. I wouldn't dwell too much on this little weird blip in Fraser where we actually see worse lodging with that half rate of Manipulator. It seemed to be a real effect, but I don't have any reason to believe why that would occur. And it certainly didn't in the other varieties. I think the big thing was just that Synergy had so much more lodging, so that showed up. Looking at Scott, lodging was really minor, but we still saw some significant effects here. So I guess if we just kind of look across the board here, of course, our control has the most lodging, still minor. Manipulator really didn't significantly improve that at all. Modus on its own was an improvement. The half rate of Modus still was, but not quite as well. And then our tank mixes are over here. Not really any better than Modus again, other than, I suppose, maybe to a certain extent, that full rate tank mix. I don't show you these two side by side because that was the only two sites. Moving on to yield. Indian Head was, again, our site that had by far the most lodging. You see these big error bars here, but that's actually more of a reflection of variability from rep to rep than it is error in our treatments. Just thought I'd mention that. Things were pretty consistent, but I did have some pretty big replicate effects. But when it came to yield, here's our control over here on the far right, and we can see really just two treatments that were a significant improvement over that. Full rate Modus actually gave us about a 10% yield advantage on average. no interactions. That was pretty consistent across varieties, even though they didn't all lodge to the same extent. And then our half rate of trinexapac was still a significant improvement over the control, but not quite to the same extent. Everything else was not always lower than the modus, which is our high sealed in treatment, but they never significantly differed from the control. Looking at outlook, we see actually on average no significant differences amongst varieties, but things were a bit variable, and we had this funny interaction here, which some of it's a little bit difficult to explain. Really, no differences in synergy. With Fraser, we had some kind of unusual yield reductions with manipulator, which I don't really have my head wrapped around. And then Connect, basically all the varieties seem to do quite well to the PGR. Looking at Prince Albert, we see that again, there was no lodging at this site, but no PGR treatments were an improvement over the control. And in fact, we have at least one here that was a significant reduction, and that was that full rate tank mix. We lost some yield there. And we see much the same thing at Scott, where again, the lodging was there, but really minor, where no yield advantage to any of the products, but that full rate tank mix, we actually saw some significant reduction. So that's not good. I would not only is that treatment is expensive, but it can be pretty dangerous, it would appear, especially if you have any kind of drought stress or maybe don't have the lodging to justify that. This is just taking a step back again and looking at our treatment effects for all the different sites for yield there. So don't need to spend a lot of time on it. We've kind of talked about it, but really just Indian Head, I guess, was the only site where we benefited from the PGR other than that one variety at Outlook. And then in the other sites, it was just either no different from the control or a yield reduction with that tank mix. Lots of quality work here. Most of it probably I don't think I need to spend a lot of time on, but with Prince Albert and Scott, no effects on quality whatsoever. Outlook, we see at least one treatment here, that full rate tank mix, where we reduced test weight. And Indian Head, we had, for the most part, no differences from the control, except actually our full rate of modus gave us the best test weights. That tells me that at least some of that loss in test weight, they were poor overall at Indian Head, but some of that loss in test weight was probably due to the lodging. But there's some, I think, maybe interactions there with the negative effects of the PGRs as well. But modus on its own, which so far has been our best treatment at that site, did actually improve test weight. Looking at TKW, not a lot going on there either. 3 sites, no effects at all. At Indian Head, a few kind of differences there, maybe some negative effects, particularly with that tank mix. Once again, modus is numerically our highest TKWs of all the different varieties, but not necessarily significantly better than the control or a lot of the other treatments. So pretty subtle effects, I would say, there with the TKW. Looking at plumpness, a few things going on. Outlook did not have this measurement, but I guess let's work our way from right to left. Why not? But looking at Scott here, we can see the big thing that jumps out to me is that we have these tank mix treatments, which is our reducing plumpness, again, having some negative impact, especially at that full rate. Full rate modus also had a significant reduction in kernel plumpness. Manipulator, that half rate, didn't seem to do too much. Prince Albert, we see kind of the same thing where our control is the best. Our worst are those 2 tank mix treatments and maybe some negative effect as well with that full rate of modus, which is an effective treatment, but I guess does have some potential to do a little bit of harm as well. So tread a bit cautiously. Indian Head, again, kind of our tank mix treatments by far the worst. And other than that, full rate modus didn't negatively impact it. The half rate did. I can't explain that, so don't spend a whole lot of time on it. Some inconsistencies there, but for the most part, it's just that tank mix that had the biggest impact. We had some interactions here as well, which I think the biggest thing is that less overall variation with Connect than maybe some of the other varieties. Protein, so not too much interesting going on here, and some kind of variation. We had the highest protein at Indian Head and Prince Albert. I should note that we used purposely really high nitrogen rates because we wanted to promote lodging, so then maybe not quite getting the yields we were hoping for. That's why our proteins are quite high. But I think, these aren't as well correlated with yield as I would have hoped. But one thing I wanted to say about this slide is with wheat, one of our concerns with PGRs is if we ever do have a really strong positive impact on yield with that PGR, that will bring down protein in a lot of cases. It's really just dilution. I would expect the same can happen with barley. So either way, if your PGR hurts yield, you might see increased protein, or if you get a big increase, which we see over here numerically, that full rate modus is our lowest protein, it might bring it down. But with malting barley, that's actually really not a concern at all. It's actually a good thing because we don't want that high barleys or sorry, that high protein with our malting barley. Getting to the end of my time here, hopefully leaving some time and questions. We'll just, I guess, give you some concluding remarks. So first and foremost, Modus did provide more consistent and larger reductions in height relative to manipulator. So that was consistent with the published work that I referred to earlier. When lodging occurred, Modus was by far the more effective of those two, Modus versus manipulator product, for reducing that lodging. So between Modus and manipulator, it's really Modus is the one that's working better on the barley. Overall, we saw some substantial yield benefits to PGRs when the lodging pressure was sufficiently high. So that was really just at Indian Head. When we didn't have that lodging, we saw no yield benefit and even some occasional negative effects, especially with that mixed treatment. Half rate tank mixes performed well overall, but for the most part, I didn't see enough advantage to Modus applied on its own at this stage here to really recommend it. We also seem to see a little bit more potential for the negative impacts. That full rate Modus or full rate tank mix were really effective for reducing height and lodging, but just I think not only is it expensive, but a little bit too big of a risk at having negative impacts to make a recommendation for that. And, for the most part, not always, I would say manipulator was less likely to have a negative effect on grain quality than Modus, or the tank mix, I guess it goes without saying, but it was also less likely to provide any real benefits as well. Last, but certainly not least, I think everyone should just kind of be aware of some market restrictions as well too, or check with buyers to make sure this is okay. Manipulator is flagged on the Keep It Clean initiative, or at least it was the last time I checked, as not being prohibited, but something you want to check with your buyers. A lot of maltsters don't want it. No known concerns with Modus, but again, I think it's a good idea just to check and make sure. I'm not really taking any time to talk about upcoming projects, but I will say that we have funding to take another crack at this project here. So we've changed it up a little bit where we've actually added an additional variety. Off the top of my head, I can't remember what that variety is, but we are dropping those two half rate of the products on their own. So we're going to, I guess, continue with this work to a certain extent and see what we learn in 2025. And with that, if there's any time, I'll take a few questions.
Awesome. We have a bit of extra time here this morning, Chris, so I'll shoot you some
Okay,
questions.
sure.
So, first one is just with your experience over the years with PGRs, do you find using them as a practice a producer would need to adopt every year and consistently do? Or is it something that a producer can make an in-season decision on based on like kind of growing season conditions? Moisture's been extremely variable the last few years. And just when talking to producers, like what approach do you find they take and what do you think is the most valuable approach to take?
Yeah, I really think you can um, try to take it on a year by year basis. We don't always know what the season's going to bring, especially as those heads start filling and the crop gets heavier. But I mean, the reality is that we, in these drier years, we just don't see a lot of benefit. That also goes with wheat, certainly with barley. So, I guess if you're kind of coming into mid-June, you don't have a lot of soil moisture, that crop isn't real lush, you've just kind of, use standard fertility rates. I think it's pretty safe to maybe hold off. I mean, I hope that you won't regret that. Where in a season like 2024, we did have all that moisture coming into the season. By the time we got to the PGR application stage, which is early stem elongation, on my 12-inch rows, that canopy was already closed right in for barley. So it was a year where I think I would take a look at that crop and say, yeah, I'm going to protect this. Lodging is a concern. So, I think like you alluded to, really just looking at current crop growth, that vegetative growth, actual moisture conditions in the soil, maybe the forecast to a certain extent, and you can make an educated decision. If you're currently looking at drought conditions and just don't have the growth, I would hold off because not only are you unlikely to see the real yield benefits that are going to pay for that application, there's some potential to cause harm as well. Not a lot, but we do see some subtle negative effects with not only barley, but in my experience with wheat as well, and also oats.
Awesome. Thank you, Chris. We'll just do one more question here.
Okay.
So I've heard claims that PGRs have potential to increase yield, even in the absence of lodging. In other words, the shorter plants correlate with a small yield bump. Your research seems to suggest this is possible, but not consistent. Can we safely say these tools can be used for yield increases or solely as lodging projects?
I think possible but not consistent is a perfect description, really. And over the last, even going back to probably like 2017, 16 kind of thing, I haven't seen a lot of yield benefits in the absence of lodging. Sometimes maybe just enough to pay for that cost of application, not really putting money in our pockets. But in some of our earlier work, we did have years where we certainly didn't get the magnitude of yield increases, but we were still getting some benefit in the absence of lodging. So it can happen. Why exactly that happens, I don't know. Just reallocating some of those resources to grain filling as opposed to vegetative growth is what would make the most sense to me. But it certainly hasn't been consistent. And when we do get the lodging is when those gains are like to be greatest. So I think if someone says you're going to get yield gains no matter what, they're certainly overselling the potential for these products. But it's yeah, possible but not consistent. I like that,
Yeah,
and
awesome.
not that helpful, unfortunately. But that's the reality of what we've seen.
And that's just, it is what it is, right? I
Yeah,
also definitely want to highlight the last point you had there too, again, with market access, and just really
yeah,
double check with your buyers if you are planning on using these, because there is some restrictions in place.
yeah. You
So
bet.
awesome. Well, thank you for joining us today, Chris.
Yeah.
We are going to try to switch back over to Lana Shaw. She's got a different internet connection now, so we've switched her to the presenter and we just still have her camera off. So looks like you're on mute there, Lana, but
Okay, trying this again.
we can hear you.
We are working? Okay. All right, we'll get right into it. So I've been working on chickpea flax as an intercrop since 2012, which is getting to be a while now. And this particular project, funded by ADF, Western Grains Research Foundation, and Flax, now Sask Oilseeds, um, that we started the first field work in 2019, and there was a bit of a COVID interruption and a delay in one of the Saskatoon sites. So it's finally finished the field work in 2023, and we've got to the point of having an ADF report. So that's the ADF number is there if anyone wants to look at the full report. And Bill May is the lead on um, this project. And so I'll be reporting on some of the results of that. And then we can talk a little bit about some general things with this intercrop. But like I said, this went on between 2019 and basically the field work was done in 2023. Swift Current, Indian Head, Melfort, Saskatoon, and Redvers were the locations. And this was a 22 treatment trial, which is quite large for the complexity of what we were trying to do. We had mixed rows or intermixed, where we were either they were exactly all mixed together in the row, or we had the largest seed side banded through the fertilizer capacity of the drill, or we did alternating rows such that each chickpea row was spaced at around 20 inches and each flax row was spaced at around 20 inches. And that included the monocrop chickpeas also being seeded at about 20-inch spacing with the alternating rows. So we also varied the flax seeding rate from 0, which is a monocrop chickpea, all the way up to 600 seeds per square meter. And I've put in a little cheat code on one particular year. This is what that amounted to. And so pounds per acre is similar enough to kilograms per hectare that gives you an idea, where the 300 seeds per square meter would be somewhere around 15 pounds an acre. So also with and without nitrogen at 60 kg per hectare, and we added in a couple of additional monocrop flax treatments, so with 0 nitrogen added and 60 kg per hectare of nitrogen added. So this was a large data set, and the combined results, to I think nobody's surprised that was working with this, found that the flax seeding rate was the main driver, and we had quite a lot of statistically significant effects on the chickpea yield and quality. So that's this here. So overall, there was some big trends. There was some effects of flax seeding rate by the crop placement. They're a little harder to tease out exactly what's going on and why and where. So we won't get into a lot of that. That's in the report for some of the nuance of it. But this does show the yield differences. So breaking out what happened on yield, what this is showing is that there was a trend where this was something on chickpea plant density averaged over the site years. So the chickpea density tended to drop as the flax seeding rate increased in the mixed rows, but with alternating it didn't, which just is telling me that there's a difference in competition when those rows are separated versus when they're intermixed. So the plants do react differently depending on what their neighbors are. So some things we saw was the row closure happened faster in the mixed rows versus alternating. So weed competition wise, we didn't rate weed competition, but I was seeing something here where there was more weed competition because of this row closure happening earlier. The flowering period in the mixed rows was shorter than in the alternative rows. And in some cases that might be bad, but in other cases that can be really helpful because chickpeas flowering in August or especially late August is actually a problem for getting that crop to mature on time. Increasing the flax seeding rate caused a decrease in lateral branching. We were trying to understand how this changes the way that the plant is growing. So what tended to happen is that the higher the flax rate went, you would just get more main stem and less of the big branches, or less number of branches actually going on. So days to maturity, overall, over all of these site years, we were getting a drop from 114 days for the chickpeas down to 109 overall. And there's some years where that would have been a considerably larger effect. Some years where there was very little effect on the maturity, but generally the trend was you add the flax and it's decreasing the maturity of the chickpeas, which is really helpful given that it is a pretty long season crop that sometimes doesn't cooperate very well on maturing evenly and nicely in the fall, which is also reflected in these green seed numbers where we're seeing the percentage of green seed drop as you add flax, more and more flax into this intercrop. So that's the effect on the chickpeas there. There wasn't a lot of other significant effects. Podding height, there was probably something there. Well, there is something there where the plants were tending to pod higher as they had the flax there, which means that you can cut it higher, the stubble, you can leave a higher stubble and take less chances of leaving things behind. So earlier maturity, better quality, and easier to harvest with the pod height. So overall with the mixed grain intercrops, there's a few reasons that people might want to consider this. It's this is changing the area of adaptation for chickpeas, and So the technique overall works quite well for this chickpea flax combination, but there's of course other mixed grain intercrops where that applies. Compared to some other things like cover cropping, for example, you've got seed costs for both of these crops. We're harvesting both of them. We're harvesting 2 crops. You have a separation cost that becomes an issue with these intercrops, and there can be some marketing limitations for them, but also maybe some opportunities. This was I think maybe 2019 picture of the intercrop here with the flax at the end of August versus a rather diseased and still rather green and still flowering chickpea that has more weeds right beside it. There was enough of that we saw over years that I really see this as a big opportunity for chickpea production and also for flax production. It gets flax out on more acres than you would normally find flax, or in geographies where they don't typically grow flax. So overall, what's happening with yield? So these bars we haven't stacked them. This is showing the chickpeas alternating. The solid bars are the red is the chickpeas and the green is the flax. The solid ones are where we've got alternating rows, and the mixed rows are the dashed. So you can kind of see that there's some happy medium happening here where we're still getting a solid chickpea crop, but we've got the addition of the flax. And what I can say for this, with the yield overall does tend to be lower for the chickpeas when they're intercropped compared to when you're just growing a single crop. However, this yield is not discounted for, that's the total yield including the green seed. So there is, when we're figuring out the economic impact of this particularly, it's a little tricky because we would have to be figuring out how to discount the quality issues that we're typically seeing with the monocrops compared to the intercrops. And then relative value of these two crops, that varies depending on what you're doing, what the year is. So a little hard to put a value on. And like I said, we've got differences in the quality or the percent green seed. So this was most of the years documented here. And so it's just a visual of the numbers that we're showing you. We did have, there's some 2022 data from Redverse that I'll talk about a little more that was excluded from this because overall it was ridiculously high. In general, the intercrops were sufficient to have very good quality green seed, or good quality chickpeas with low green seed. In 2022, our intercrops, some of them were still really high, but that was under some rather crazy conditions. This is Michelle Hubbard and Ishita Patel checking out our trial that year. And that year, we ended up with 22 inches of rainfall and a super lush crop. And there was some of those intercrops, particularly where they had nitrogen on them, where there was, we were seeing a lot of just chickpeas outright dying or reflowering late in the year, a lot of misbehaving chickpeas, which you would expect with 22 inches of rain. And this is what happened as far as yield goes. It doesn't show the quality results, but this was the intercrops when you grew them mixed with no added nitrogen. We're getting quite a respectable combined crop here. And alternating rows, not doing quite as well. The chickpeas overall were not doing as well under that kind of condition. So there's only certain instances where we're really seeing sort of some differentiation between the alternating versus mixed rows. From what I saw in 2022, under heavy rain, under those conditions, the mixed rows tended to be performing better, which is a little surprising. A few years ago, I had done a basic little meta-analysis or a comparison of some of the early results from these trials, and then also added in some North Dakota results from Williston and Carrington. They had done some similar trials. So I took the medium sort of usual production method where we're doing a medium for flax rate and compared them. So the monocrops, the disease levels in the monocrops versus the intercrops, I've got charted out here. And then, which we generally are seeing a substantial reduction when there is disease pressure. Sometimes it's just messy and there's no statistically significant difference. But overall, usually we're seeing a reduction in disease. So, and then what I did was take those sites and chart them up, plot them out here. So monocrop disease on the x-axis, intercrop disease on the y. If they were exactly the same, we should be seeing them falling along this red line. If the intercrops were causing more disease in the chickpeas, I should see them above the red line. None of them were. But so what this is showing was about a 50% reduction in the intercrop, which is this 0.467. That's what that's suggesting, is about a 50% reduction in the disease due to the intercrop. So overall, the flax seeding rate is really crucial here, but you also need a good, strong stand of chickpeas. You can't do a little bit of chickpeas, lots of flax, because it's not harvestable. You can't thresh the flax without a substantial amount of chickpeas in there to help thresh the flax bolls. That's how this intercrop is harvestable. It has been done on thousands of acres, so it is possible to harvest this. The stability of the economic returns is the greatest advantage. So a saleable, solid, dependable chickpea crop, which has been elusive for a lot of the prairies, is what this is giving us, with relatively less need for using fungicide in this crop. So we've proven that it works in areas that are adapted and semi-adapted to chickpeas. So we've taken this as far north as Melfort for several years, and we're in the black soil zone where we are not in chickpea country, and we've been able to reliably grow good quality chickpeas when we're doing it in this intercrop. So generally the advice is to use a full chickpea seeding rate, place the seed at 1 inch or deeper for the chickpeas if you can get them into moisture. The flax seeding rate at about 20 pounds an acre, but you can dial that back a bit depending on your equipment and some experience, but you do need a good amount of flax in there. If you're in a more dry area that's more typically chickpea zone, that probably can be a little lower. The failures was if we had a late rain after some dry conditions, and then sometimes some of this stuff will regreen. So the flax sometimes will start flowering again, or the chickpeas can start regreening and flowering again under some conditions. We haven't had a lot of really wet years in this data set. Ours in 2022 was basically the only significant one. So acknowledging again, Bill May being the lead of this, and Michelle Hubbard, also very crucial on the pathology side. We've got Ag Canada, Melfort, Indian Head, Swift Current, Surf Crew. The U of S was also doing this trial, but they ended up not including the data in here. This was funded by Saskatchewan and Western Greens Research Foundation, and through the ADF program. And I think we've got a good amount of time for questions.
Yes, we do. Thank you for your presentation, Lana, and I'm glad we were able to get you back connected here this morning. So our first question here is, do you have any thoughts on why the green seed content was significantly higher in red burst that this data had to be excluded?
So we were calling anything that looked not good enough to eat, including that in the green seed. So and really, like, some of that was disease. So not all of that was green seed. Some of it was diseased little moldy ones, and so there was just some confounding effects there where it was hard to separate why exactly does this chickpea look bad. So I think that was probably part of the problem, just the amount of disease pressure and um, the extreme conditions that we were having. Some of those plots, some of those treatments had negligible yield. It was to that level that that so it didn't make for some nice tidy things in the data. But also there was like half of one rep that was way more badly affected by that than the other half of the one rep. So high variability conditions due to that 22 inches of rain.
Yeah, 22 inches of rain is a heck of a lot.
Nine of those inches came in one morning.
That's crazy.
It was.
Alrighty, our next question here is, are you seeing this being adopted by producers? If so, how are they actually like incorporating it into their rotation? So whereabouts would you put it in between your cereal, pulse, and oilseed?
We are seeing people adopting this. We don't have good numbers on it because there's no data there's very limited data collected on this other than through crop insurance, and people haven't been that keen to put this stuff onto crop insurance because the products aren't really designed for this. Where it would fit is often in between two cereal crops. So you'd plant this on a cereal stubble. You might follow this up with another cereal. It can go in rotation, like a 4-year rotation with canola, but your ability to control volunteer canola is not good in this either. So it depends how much that is a concern. And I'm not sure. I think it would be lovely to have a good data set on that, other than just me talking to people.
Yeah, absolutely. Alrighty, and just our last question here for you is, what type of chickpea were you using in these trials?
This one was leader. For this ADF project, we were using leader. We've used Orion's previous to that. So
Okay.
there's also a new project, relatively new project. It's going into its third and final year, where we're comparing 3 different chickpea varieties and 3 different flax varieties for suitability for this intercrop.
Awesome. Alrighty, so that concludes our questions there, Lana. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. And now we will head on to our next presentation. So our next presenter is Zoe Galbraith out of the Conservation Learning Center, which is just south of PA here, and I get the pleasure of working with often. So we'll have Zoe share her screen here. Awesome. If you just want to pop that into presentation mode, everything looks good.
Awesome. Okay. Yeah, so like Ali said, my name is Zoe and I'm from the Conservation Learning Center Research Farm located near Prince Albert. I always like to throw up a drone picture of the site when I'm doing presentations just to show you what our topography is like. It's a very classic prairie pothole scenario, lots of wetlands and stuff on site. So the project I chose to share with you today is an Adopt funded project. And we looked at demonstrating spring camelina as an alternative crop for the north central Saskatchewan region. And our interest in camelina kind of came from, always being on the lookout for a new crop that we can incorporate into our rotations to help lengthen them. And camelina seemed like a potentially good option given that it's got a shorter growing season. Also, it's quite drought tolerant, and we have been having some drier than normal years recently. So that was something that interested us about it as well. It's also sometimes called false flax. So just before I get into it, I wanted to share some of our weather data from last season as well, just to provide some context. So in 2024, like most of the province, early spring was very cool and very wet for us. May and June in particular were very wet. We got about double our average rainfall in those months, and it was also several degrees cooler than normal for those months as well. It was a little bit of a shorter growing season for us too. So our last spring frost was on May 25th, and our first fall frost was on September 6th. So that's about 104 frost-free days if you're counting. So definitely a good year for us to be testing out this camelina to see if it's something that would fit in our growing season. So if you're unfamiliar with camelina, it's an oilseed crop. Currently in Saskatchewan, it's grown under contract. The oil and meal has diverse uses. So one of the bigger ones is as a biofuel. It's also used in adhesives, resins, and feed. I've been seeing a lot of social media ads lately for camelina for use in horses and dogs and that kind of thing. Generally speaking, it has lower input costs than canola, and that's in part due to low seed costs, but also it has lower fertilizer requirements than canola as well. Field selection is pretty important with camelina and can be a little bit tricky. It's sensitive to group 2 herbicide residues, so that can definitely be a concern seeing as we're looking to put it on cereal stubble. So that's something to consider as well. It has a very small seed size. It's quite similar in size to alfalfa. So shallow seeding and good seed to soil contact are really important for good emergence. It has quite good frost tolerance, which is really exciting for the PA area, and natural pod shatter resistance. So it is suitable for straight cutting. So given that this was our first experience with camelina, we just wanted to start off with a basic agronomic demonstration to see how spring camelina production would work in north central Saskatchewan. So we focused in on seeding depth, seeding rate, and fertility. This slide also has a picture of the camelina seed just to illustrate for you how tiny that seed size is. So like I said, our first factor of interest here was fertility. So we looked at 2 different nitrogen application rates. So our lower rate was 45 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare, and our higher rate was 90 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. So that's about 40 and 80 pounds of nitrogen per acre. And we chose those rates because past research has shown that yield is maximized around 90 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare, but the yields can be quite good with as low as 45 kilograms of nitrogen applied. Our next factor of interest was seeding depth. So definitely given that small seed size, it's not recommended to seed below 1/2 inch deep. The problem in our region specifically is that we're primarily no-till, and we do tend to have very high levels of crop residue in the spring. So that can make getting consistent shallow seeding depth a little bit of a challenge for producers in our region. So because of that, we incorporated a slightly deeper seeding depth as well, looking at between 3/4 to 1 inch deep. Finally, we wanted to consider seeding rate, so we chose 500, 700, and 900 seeds per meter squared. So that's about 7, 10, and 12 pounds per acre. And we chose those rates based on past demonstrations that have been carried out throughout the province. From what I remember, the camelina production manuals tend to recommend on the lower end of that range, so closer to 7 pounds per acre. So we set this up as a split plot factorial. So we had seeding depth as our main plot, and then seeding rate and nitrogen application were randomized within that. For data collection, we took a spring soil test, and so that was first to determine how much nitrogen was present in the soil already, but then also to determine P, K, and S fertility so that we could make sure that other nutrients were non-limiting. We also wanted to obviously see what emergence was like, and so we did that in 2 ways. So first of all, we did spring plant counts and converted that to plant density, but we also just did a visual uniformity rating as well. We recorded the maturity date of each plot. We collected grain yield for each plot, and when the final report is available, we'll also have an economic analysis included in that as well. So first of all, looking at our spring soil test, we found we had 44 pounds of nitrogen per acre available in the top 12 inches. So if you combine that with our lowest nitrogen application rate of about 40 pounds of nitrogen, that meant for our low nitrogen treatment, there was about 84 pounds of nitrogen available. For our high nitrogen rate, same thing. If you combine it, what we applied with what was already present, that led to about 124 pounds of nitrogen per acre total. And I also wanted to illustrate, given that I was talking earlier about the lower nitrogen application requirements for camelina versus canola. If I was putting canola on this site, aiming for a 50 bushel per acre yield goal, knowing that there's 44 pounds of nitrogen already present, I'd probably be applying around 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre. So even in the highest nitrogen application rate for my camelina, I'm only applying 80 pounds of nitrogen per acre on top of what's already present. So even at the highest application rates for this project, we're still below what we would normally apply for canola. So the next thing we wanted to see was how seeding depth would affect uniformity of emergence. And so a reasoning for that being that knowing our heavy chaff levels and stuff like that, when we go into seeding, sometimes we end up, when we're shallow seeding, having areas where we hit a pocket of chaff and then nothing, we don't hit our proper seeding depth and nothing emerges. Or vice versa, we're in a lot of chaff, then we hit a spot with no chaff and accidentally end up going a little bit too deep, that kind of thing. So we wanted to do a visual rating of emergence for that reason, just to see, are our lines coming out nice and uniform. So we did that by laying a meter stick across a row of camelina in the field. If we could see seedlings along the entirety of that meter stick, we rated that as 100% uniformity. If seedlings only appeared across, half of the meter stick, that was 50% uniformity, and so on. So we found that with shallow seeding at the recommended depth, we had consistent uniformity, 100% uniformity across every single plot. With deep seeding, it was slightly reduced, so we were looking at more like 96% uniformity on average, but still quite good and a little bit surprising that it wasn't a more pronounced visual impact of deeper seeding. Now, if we look more closely at the effect of seed depth on plant density by considering, our actual plant density numbers from when we went out and counted the number of plants present, that's when we started to see the effects. So I have plant density here on my y-axis and my different seeding depth treatments along the bottom. So I have the shallow seeded, 1/2 inch depth on the left and my deep seeded on the right. And so it's very visually apparent here that deep seeding did significantly reduce plant density relative to shallow seeding. So while visually our plants were emerging evenly and in a uniform manner, once we actually start counting those plant densities, we can see that there was a negative impact of deeper seeding. So how does then seeding rate affect plant density? So once again, I have plant density here on the y-axis, but this time I have seeding rate along the bottom with the shallow seeded treatment on the left going all the way up to, or the lower seeding rate treatment on the left going all the way up to my highest seeding rate on the right. And so as we can see, the highest seeding rate of 900 seeds per meter squared did significantly increase plant density relative to the other seeding rate treatments. But perhaps more importantly then, we were wondering, does the increase in plant density resulting from that higher seeding rate actually translate to a yield benefit? And we found that it did not. So here I have my seeding rates along the bottom again, but this time I'm showing yield in pounds per acre on the y-axis. And as you can see, there was no significant difference in yield across any of these seeding rates. So that is telling us that the camelina yield was maximized at the lowest seeding rate. So that works out to about the 7 pounds per acre seeding rate. And I will say overall, our camelina yields were quite good. We averaged at about 2,000 pounds per acre for the trial as a whole, which is fairly good for our region. Now, still looking at yields, then we're wondering how does our applied fertility affect the yield? And so I have my lower fertility rate on the left and my higher nitrogen application rate on the right. And very interestingly here, we saw no impact on yield from increasing the fertilizer rate. So that's telling us that once again, the camelina yields were maximized at the low nitrogen application rate. Finally, we also wanted to consider if there were any maturity differences resulting from the different agronomic practices that we were looking at. And we found that there were no differences in maturity between any of the treatments. So the trial as a whole matured at the same time. So we seeded this on May 14th, which is relatively early for our area. And it matured on August 23rd. So that's a days to maturity of about 101 days. So if you remember back to my weather slide, we had about 104 frost-free days this year. So it's pretty in line with what a shorter growing season would look like for us. We expected a days to maturity of between 85 to 100 days just based on the variety that we were growing. So we were definitely on the later end of that range, which I think is not surprising given how cold and wet June and May were. So just some quick conclusions here. Shallow seeding at the recommended depth resulted in slightly better uniformity of emergence and did significantly improve plant stands relative to the deeper seeding treatments. However, we didn't see any significant differences in yield across any of our treatments. And I think that can maybe just be attributed to how successful emergence was in all of our treatments. Definitely still would not be recommending seeding deeper than normal or anything like that. I hadn't touched on it too much in my other slides, but we did look at the interactions between all of our factors of interest, and we didn't find any significant relationships between seeding depth, seeding rate, and fertility. So overall, my conclusion here is that camelina yields can be maximized at low seeding rates and low nitrogen rates, obviously provided that your spring emergence is good. And also that this could be a suitable crop for our region. So this is a promising new option for producers in the PA area. Just want to leave you with some projects to look out for from the CLC in 2025. So this past fall, we seeded a winter cereal showcase looking at different varieties of winter wheat, fall rye, and winter triticale. So that's one we're excited to see this season. We'll also be planting some cantaloupe, comparing how the size profiles look when they're planted in a high tunnel versus in a field environment. We'll also be carrying out a demonstration of the regional impact of different varietal traits and flowering timing in hard red spring wheat. So thanks for your attention. I'm happy to answer any questions, or if you'd prefer, take down my contact information and get a hold of us at any time.
Thank you, Zoe, for sharing all the info here. I am really looking forward to your cantaloupe project. I hope to get some fruit out of it.
Sounds good.
So one of the first questions is, what do you find the uptake for producers on this one is? Like, have you run into some producers in the region that are actually growing camelina?
Yeah, so we first heard about camelina through a local producer actually who has been growing it under contract for a few years. And since we demonstrated it at the farm, we've also had another local producer try it out on their operation. So I think it's still relatively new, and maybe the contract growing piece of it is a little bit of a limitation, but we have been seeing uptake in our area for sure.
Alrighty, the next question is, what is available currently for herbicides, like any in-season weed control?
Yeah, that's a good point. So we were able to apply a herbicide for grassy weed control. Um, and so the broadleaf weed control, I think, is a little bit more of a challenge. I'm not super familiar with what's out there, but based on what we had available to us, we were able to apply Assure 2, I believe, this season.
Awesome. And just based off your picture there, camelina, it looks like the seed size is even smaller than canola.
Yeah, it is. It's similar to alfalfa, I'd say. It's very small.
Did you run into any issues with like calibrating the drill or anything with just that tiny a seed size?
Not for us, but we do use a little bit of a specialty seeder. So um, I can't say personally that I know how it goes, but like I said, we do have producers locally that have been growing it for a little while. So it is possible. I'm not sure how tricky that would be on a regular seeder.
Awesome. Alrighty, I think that is all of our questions for you here this morning. So thank you again for joining us, Zoe. Much appreciated.
Thanks.
And we'll invite our next speaker. So up next, we have Amber Wall from the Wheatland Conservation Area, which is located near Swift Current, Saskatchewan. So we're jumping to the other end of the province for this one.
Okay, hopefully everything looks good there and you can hear me well.
Yep, it all looks great.
Perfect. So like Ali mentioned, I'm at Wheatland Conservation Area here in Swift Current. Today I'm going to be sharing the results of a small plot research trial entitled Establishing Nitrogen and Seeding Rate Recommendations for Composite Yellow Mustard. This is a 3-year strategic field program trial, and it's funded by the Sustainable Canadian Agriculture Partnership. So we've just completed the second year of this nitrogen and seed rate trial where we're comparing 2 mustard varieties. It's a fairly new composite mustard, the AAC Yellow 80, and we're comparing that to the open pollinated Andante mustard. So this project takes place near the 3 mustard growing regions of the province, those being in Swift Current, Indian Head, and Redverse. It's a randomized complete block design and replicated 4 times at each site each year. Along with establishing that optimal nitrogen and seed rates, the big picture or objective is to maximize productivity and mitigate inefficient crop inputs like fertilizer and seed. Nitrogen is, of course, essential and needed in the greatest amount compared to the other macronutrients. And nitrogen uptake takes place throughout the growing season, so moisture is very essential in that process, and we'll see that showing in the results of our project here. To start off each year, composite soil samples of the area are submitted for residual nutrients and basic quality analysis. So we do have the odd site year here with some high residual nitrogen, but generally a decent test area and some slight differences in soil depending on location. As mentioned, the project was comprised of 2 separate trials that included both varieties, AAC Yellow 80 and Andante. The first trial evaluates each variety at increasing nitrogen rates, and those rates include the soil residual plus the nitrogen that was applied as urea. The second trial includes each variety with balanced fertility, but at increasing seed rates that are ultimately targeting a range in plant stand of 5 to 13 plants per square foot. So I didn't do a combined site analysis of all locations just because our conditions are so different. We can see here our cumulative precipitation by the end of each month from May to August compared to the 10-year average for each location. We ended up having fairly similar totals each year in Swift Current, but kind of opposite in time that we received the precipitation. So at Swift Current in 2023, we started off really dry and finally ended up getting some rain in July and August when it was too late, as well as a hailstorm. Whereas the dark green line there in 2024, we seeded into good topsoil moisture, had some timely showers for the next month, but ended up with below average precipitation in July and August, and that had quite a negative effect on flowering as well as seed development. Redverse had 2 very different growing seasons. In 2023, well below their average growing season precipitation, but they did have some residual moisture from the previous year. And then this past year, as Lana mentioned, they received more precipitation over one day in June than they did all of those 4 months in the previous year, followed by next to no precipitation in July, so definitely not ideal. And again, same as the other sites, very hot in July. Indian Head was pretty dry in 2023, receiving 49% of their average rainfall May through August. Again, they had some residual moisture for that growing season, but not ideal. This past year, although it looks fairly close to average, there were many prolonged periods of hot, dry days during flowering and maturity. And like Chris mentioned, they had some heavy winds, so we'll see some lodging effects there as well. So a couple tough years for this project. Focusing first on the seed rate trial, we were able to get enough seed to use the same seed lot for all 3 years, so that's nice to remove some variability when looking this close at seed rates. With our 2 varieties and 5 seed rates, we end up with 10 treatments, targeting plant stands above and below that recommended plant stand of 7 to 11 plants per square foot. Assuming 50% emergence for the small seeds, those seed rates come out to 10, 14, 18, 22, and 26 seeds per square foot. And then I've got seeds per square meter in the next column. Indante has a 1,000 seed weight of 6.3 grams. It's a bit larger than AAC Yellow 80, which is 5.5 grams per 1,000 seeds. So that is why the treatments are discussed in seeds per square foot or seeds per square meter rather than pounds per acre, so that we can ensure we're comparing the same target plant stand across both varieties. Here we have our resulting emergence for each variety by increasing seed rate. The yellow bars are the AAC Yellow 80. Indante is consistently giving a slightly higher plant population. Swift current plant population means were the lowest, ranging from 59 to 124 plants per square meter, or 5 to 12 plants per square foot, so just above and below that targeted plant stand. Redverse ended up with 76 to 166 plants per square meter, or 7 to 15 plants per square foot, and the highest plant populations were at Indian Head with 96 to 219 plants per square meter, which is 9 to 20 plants per square foot, which is getting quite high, but certainly increasing with seed rate. Moving along to yield and Swift Current, we had fairly similar resulting years, and despite that hail in 2023, 2024 still ended up yielding a bit lower, partially because we had such high emergence in 2024, thanks to that good moisture at seeding that we don't often get. So that many more plants competing during our usual July heat did not have a good effect on yield or seed maturation and quality. But the combined analysis does show a significant difference in variety, with AAC Yellow 80 out yielding Indante by more than 100 pounds per acre in the 2 site year analysis. Here we have both years graphed together for each variety, with a fairly linear average for the combined site year analysis in black. Statistically, the lowest seed rate was the highest yielding treatment for both mustard varieties, and yield decreased as we increased seeding rate. This is likely very dependent on moisture each year. Maybe the 150 to 194 seeds per square meter could have a higher yield potential if conditions were more favorable, but you're definitely seeing a yield loss at those 2 highest seed treatments of 237 seeds per square meter or higher. AAC Yellow yielding 80 to 1,000 pounds per acre at the lowest seed rate, and Indante the lowest seed rate yielding almost 800 pounds per acre in Swift Current. A couple pictures from Swift Current here, Yellow 80s on the top there, Indante on the bottom. This is the low, middle, and highest seed rates in increasing order. These were taken June 11th. The stand got a little more uniform as your seed rate increased, but you can tell those higher seed rates are fighting for moisture. The stems were getting quite spindly and weak, and there's just too many plants there. Moving on to Redverse in the southeast. In the combined analysis, the varieties did not yield significantly different from one another. However, that did vary by year, and AAC Yellow 80 out yielded Indante in 24, which we could maybe consider the more normal year, and that's what I expect in the coming year as well. Here again, both years graphed together with the combined 2-year analysis in black. So since they had 2 completely opposite years for precipitation, the trend is sort of flat or favoring that middle seed rate slightly. In 2024, the best treatment is leaning towards that lower end of the range, yielding about 1,400 pounds per acre. So quite good yields, but not clearly defined quite yet. The highest yielding Indonte mustard treatments resulting from seed rates ranging from that lowest 108 seeds to 194 seeds per square meter. Still really good yields in general. That's over 25 bushels an acre. Lastly, our highest yielding site was at Indian Head. AAC Yellow 80 out yielding Indonte by almost 100 pounds per acre in the combined site year analysis. In 2024, there did end up being some severe lodging due to those heavy winds, and it was a challenge to harvest those bent and broken stems. So we also speculate that header losses were higher in those higher seeding rates as well. Again, a negative yield response to increasing seeding rates. This is usually more common for our Swift Current site, but it does happen when those other sites have those drier conditions later in the season as well. So this decrease in yield is looking to largely be attributed to the excellent emergence in spring, up to 24 plants per square foot, which is much higher than what we were targeting. Looking at the combined site year analysis of AAC Yellow 80, a linear decrease with increasing seeding rate yielding 1,700 pounds per acre. Indonte was not linear, especially in 2023, but the highest yield resulting from that first seed rate and yielding over 1,500 pounds per acre. Part 2, the 7 nitrogen rates, increasing from soil nitrogen only to 160 pounds per acre of soil nitrogen plus applied. Again, looking at the same 2 varieties. Nitrogen rate effects on establishment were similar at each location and fairly inconsistent, as it is greatly limited by moisture. Indonte yellow mustard resulted in a higher plant stand than AAC Yellow 80 at each site, with nitrogen rate having little effect on emergence. In the combined analysis, mustard emergence was the lowest at Swift Current, establishment ranging from 71 to 109 plants per square meter, or 7 to 10 plants per square foot, so right where we want it to be. There was a seed rate mistake on the nitrogen trial at Redverse in 2024. The plots were actually only seeded about 2 pounds per acre, but it still turned out really well. Redverse, their plant stand ranged from 93 to 131 plants per square meter, which was 8 to 12 plants per square foot. Indian Head, the plant population ranged from 165 to 191 plants per square meter, so well above that target plant stand again. Much of the same variety and yearly trends as the previous trial, starting with Swift Current, AAC Yellow 80 composite mustard out yielding the Indonte, and again we ended up with lower yields in 2024, largely in part due to the combination of the high spring emergence followed by that hot, dry July. This had us combining the first week of August, so not a lot of opportunity for high nitrogen uptake or seed development. And that did leave us with some mixed results. We're not quite able to identify the exact upper nitrogen limit yet, but both mustard yields increased with nitrogen up to a certain amount where it finally leveled off there near the top. In the combined site analysis at Swift Current, AAC Yellow 80 yields increased up to 120 pounds per acre of total nitrogen and yielded about 1,000 pounds per acre or 20 bushels per acre, which is still pretty good. Indonte yields increased up to 100 pounds of total nitrogen and yielded over 850 pounds per acre. Couple pictures at those increasing nitrogen rates in Swift Current here. The plots looked really good overall. The combined site analysis for Redverse showing much of the same variety and year effects as previously discussed. And both mustard variety yields increasing with nitrogen here, almost linearly looking at the combined site year analysis. Both varieties at Redverse resulted in yield increases, when up to 160 pounds of nitrogen was applied total. AAC Yellow 80 averaging a yield of over 1,400 pounds per acre, significantly higher than the Andante mustard, which yielded over 1,200 pounds per acre, so quite good yields coming out of the southeast. Lastly, at Indian Head, our highest yielding site again. In the combined 2-year analysis for AAC Yellow 80, the yields increased up to 140 pounds per acre of applied nitrogen and yielded over 1,700 pounds per acre. I suspect this could look a bit more linear after a 3rd year of data if Indian Head gets some decent moisture this coming year, but great yields. Andante mustard yield increased up to 160 pounds of total nitrogen and yielded on average about 1,600 pounds per acre. As for the other data collected, there was no lodging effect at Swift Current or Redverse, but as mentioned in 2024, especially compared to 2023, lodging was quite severe at Indian Head, with the combination of those high winds and high seeding rates as well. In the nitrogen trial, the first graph there, lodging increased with nitrogen rates up to a rating of 5 out of 9, so pretty bad. And it was even a bit worse in the seed rate trial, a rating of 7 out of 9, so certainly some harvest difficulties there. Mustard variety and nitrogen effects on plant height were similar at each location in the combined site year analysis. The composite mustard AAC Yellow 80 resulted in taller plants than Andante at all sites, generally by 5 to 6 centimeters. Seed development was largely affected by drought and high temperatures, so we saw rapid maturity in most site years, and each being pretty early. There are trends suggesting maturity is delayed at higher nitrogen rates and lower seed rates, and in some cases Yellow 80 was delayed a day or two, but not huge differences overall, as the year-to-year differences are the largest. In summary, we see AAC Yellow 80 consistently out-yielding Andante, so that's good. That give a nod to our breeding that's going on there. Seed rates toward the lower end of the recommended rate have shown to be optimal, but more robust data would be nice in order to make the best recommendation. The lowest seed rate was 108 seeds per square meter. So that AAC Yellow 80 with a size of 5.5 grams, that works out to be about 5 per pound acre. It does appear that mortality isn't as high when there is decent moisture at seeding, but mortality could be higher depending on your seed source or seed size if it's a lot smaller. So that's important to pay attention to and take into consideration. Maybe your region isn't quite as low as 50% mortality, but maybe your seed is a lot smaller. So we are looking next year for this project. You know, we don't know, but we think we could even seed a little smaller. This project didn't quite, a little bit lower. This project didn't quite reach, as low as we maybe wanted to go, considering this seed does have pretty good emergence compared to the previous research we've done like this on brown mustard. Nitrogen rates toward the lower end of the range of the recommendation will be adequate in dry years, but you should still target 100 to 120 N in the dry brown soil zone. And then we do see yield increases from 140 to 160 applied nitrogen in those regions with those bit better conditions, better soil conditions, more precipitation. This trial, it is focused on the nitrogen response, but it's important to soil test and look at other deficiencies that might be there, for example, zinc and boron responses that we have seen in the past. So thanks to Shannon and Corey for developing this project. Samantha, she's the acting oilseed specialist. Mustard 21 provided us that AAC Yellow 80 seed. And of course, the Southeast Research Farm and Indian Head and their staff for helping out with this project. And of course, our staff at Wheatland here. So I should have time for any questions.
Perfect. Thank you for the presentation, Amber. Just a couple questions for you. So first off was the mustard planted in a metering system planter?
Everyone I believe everyone has a cone seeder. We all sort of have similar equipment there, so very different than a precision drill that someone might have today, which probably also affects our mortality a bit. I think Indian Head has a disc drill, and I think Redverse and us as well. We used a hoe drill there, so yeah, not all our projects. The seed is weighed out according to the exact space that you are seeding, but probably not as accurate as a precision drill that lots of farmers have today.
Yeah, absolutely. That's fair. The other question I have for you is down in your area, as you said, mustard, it is the mustard growing region of the province. With that, if producers were starting to consider maybe going from canola to mustard, what advantages do you see with growing mustard?
I think the market is starting to trend down now, but there is a slight difference in seed cost. You do have to, this is a composite, this new yellow 80, you do have to buy new seed every year, so it's not quite as valuable maybe as that used to be, that difference in seed cost. But again, too, I think you can apply lower nitrogen slightly compared to canola as well. Yeah, and you just want to make sure your weed control there. If you're switching from canola to mustard, that might take a few years to get those volunteers out and clean that up. So just want to be careful and prepare your land there if you're switching from canola to mustard.
Awesome. Thank you, Amber. I believe that's all the questions we have for you this morning, but thank you for sharing the presentation. We appreciate having you on.
Thank you.
Alrighty, so next up we have Alex Waldner. She comes from the Western Applied Research Corporation, which is located near Scott, Saskatchewan. So we will welcome Alex here.
Okay, hello. Does everything look good?
Everything looks great.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so good morning, everyone. My name is Alex Waldner. I'm the research associate at the Western Applied Research Corporation based out of Scott. And today I'll be sharing results from our lentil aphanomyces trial, looking at how nitrogen rates, seed treatments, and seeding dates can impact root disease. So I'm sure everyone's quite familiar with aphanomyces root rot. It's a fairly prevalent disease within Saskatchewan, affecting our primary pulse crops, peas and lentils. And one of the major challenges with this disease is the lack of effective control options available. So crop rotation still remains one of the best approaches. A 6 to 8 year rotation is recommended to reduce spore levels in the soil. But these aphanomyces spores are very resilient and can survive up to 10 to 15 years in the soil. So this, of course, makes long-term management very difficult, especially in areas where pulses are a key part of rotations. Another option includes growing non-host pulse crops such as soybeans or fenugreek. However, these crops also have some of their own challenges in terms of agronomics and marketing as well. There is active research looking at ways to improve aphanomyces management, and some of these strategies that are being researched include liming applications to the soil, different seed treatment products and biological products, and as well as developing genetic resistance. Saskatchewan is a significant producer of lentils, so evaluating management strategies to reduce aphanomyces is very important for supporting lentil production. So for this trial, we are going to be focusing on lentils, like I said earlier, but we wanted to look at some agronomic strategies for reducing aphanomyces that producers might be able to implement themselves. So first of all, we wanted to look at nitrogen fertilizers. So generally, nitrogen fertilizer isn't applied to pulse crops, since they are capable of nodulation and producing and supplying their own nitrogen. But we wanted to look at applications of nitrogen at seeding to see if we could reduce disease development, with the idea that applying nitrogen would provide an early boost and kind of promote more vigorous plant growth early on, as well as support plants if nodulation doesn't occur due to diseased roots, so that those plants are still getting some of the nitrogen that they need. Next, we wanted to look at seed treatments. So, and some of the work that Dr. Chatterton has done, the combination of Rancona Trio seed treatment with Aphanomyces-tolerant pea lines showed reduction in disease severity. So we just wanted to look at this seed treatment on lentils in this trial. And then finally, we wanted to look at seeding date with the idea that earlier seeding may allow roots to establish before Aphanomyces has a chance to infect the roots and cause severe damage. So based on that, we developed our treatment list. We had 3 different nitrogen rates. So we had no nitrogen applied, and then 50 and 100 pounds per acre applied. This was applied as urea side-banded at seeding. We also looked at untreated seed compared to our seed treated with Rancona Trio. And then we had 2 different seeding dates. We compared early versus late seeding. Our seeding dates did vary a bit by location. So our early seeding dates ranged from April 29th to May 12th. And then our late seeding dates ranged from May 13th to May 23rd. So this trial was set up at 4 locations throughout the province within our Agri-ARM network. We had trials set up at Warwick, at Scott, at ISASC, at Outlook, at WCA, at Swift Current, and then at SURF at Redverse. And this was the first year that we did this trial, and we will be continuing it for 2025 and 2026 to get a total of 3 years of data at the end of this study. And then just some basic agronomics. We used the variety CDC Impulse, and we targeted a seeding rate of 190 seeds per meter squared. We did apply phosphorus, potassium, and sulfur fertilizer to be non-limiting based on soil tests at each location. And then, of course, we also used a rhizobial inoculant at seeding. So we had good moisture levels at all sites this year, especially in the spring, which is really important for this type of trial to make sure that we're seeing disease in the plots so that we can really assess the effectiveness of these treatments. Moisture can worsen Aphanomyces spread and infection because spores travel through the soil via moisture, which is why you typically see higher infection rates in wetter years. So all sites this year were above their respective long-term averages in terms of moisture, except the Swift Current site. You can see on this right-hand side, it was slightly below at 91%. They still had fairly good moisture conditions, especially in the spring in April and May. They actually received double their normal precipitation levels. And this was similar across all the sites in the spring. April, May, and June received well above normal precipitation levels. In July and August, it did start to get a little drier on average for most of the sites. And then September, we started to see either above or comparable moisture conditions to long-term averages. All of these sites were under dryland production, except for Outlook was an irrigated site, so it received an additional 18.7 millimeters of irrigation as well. So we had a pretty extensive data collection list for this trial, but for this presentation, I'm just going to focus on the bolded items here. So I'm going to show some of the results from the shoot and root disease severity ratings, the nodulation ratings, as well as identification of pathogens from root samples that we submitted, and then looking at the yield as well. And this is just a little picture of our summer students washing roots this summer. So starting with our shoot disease symptoms, we used a rating scale developed by Dr. Chatterton ranging from 1 to 5, where 1 is a healthy plant and 5 is a dead plant. And then ratings in between here kind of looked at symptoms of yellowing, stunting, and leaf necrosis. So here's a picture of some of the plants that we pulled at our trial in Scott. So you can see there's quite a difference in the above ground plant symptoms between these treatments. So diving into the results, I'm going to start in the upper left-hand corner here with the response to nitrogen rate. So nitrogen rate had a significant effect on shoot disease symptoms at Scott and at Outlook, and they had a marginal effect at Redverse as well. So at Scott and Outlook, the highest nitrogen rate at 100 pounds per acre resulted in the lowest disease ratings, although at Outlook this wasn't significantly different from our no nitrogen applied. And then at Redverse, we actually saw the opposite trend where our highest nitrogen rate at 100 pounds per acre resulted in the highest shoot disease severity ratings compared to the no nitrogen. And then at Swift Current, we didn't see a significant response here. Moving on to the upper right-hand corner, we have our response to the seed treatment. And we didn't see a significant response here across any of the sites. And then in the bottom left-hand corner, we have our response to seeding date. So seeding date had a significant effect at Scott, Swift Current, and Outlook. The Redverse site isn't included because they didn't have both seeding date treatments, so they won't be included in any of the seeding date results. But at Swift Current and Outlook, late seeding resulted in significantly higher disease ratings than early seeding. But then we actually saw the opposite at Swift Current, where that late seeding had higher disease ratings than the early seeding. So altogether, nitrogen rate and seeding date showed significant responses at most of the sites, but the trends were kind of inconsistent across the sites. Moving on to root disease symptoms. So again, we used a scale developed by Dr. Chatterton, ranging from 0 to 5, where 0, the roots have no symptoms. So you can see in the picture here, this kind of shows a visual representation of that rating. And then 5, the roots are starting to show signs of decay, loss of root mass, and then that characteristic honey brown crown area as well. And then ratings in between this just kind of showed varying degrees of these symptoms. So you can see this in the picture as well. Okay, so again, starting with the response to nitrogen rate. Nitrogen rate significantly affected root disease at Scott, where the no nitrogen had the highest disease ratings and the highest rate of nitrogen at 100 pounds per acre had the lowest disease ratings. So that's kind of similar to what we had kind of hypothesized at the beginning of the trial, that adding nitrogen would help to reduce some of that disease development. But we didn't see a significant response at any of the other sites. We saw kind of a similar trend here at Redverse, kind of an opposite trend here at Outlook, but again, not significant across these other sites. When we move on to the response to seed treatment, we see that there was not a significant response here to seed treatment again across these sites. And then when we look at our seeding date, we see that early seeding resulted in significantly lower root disease ratings at Scott and at Swift Current, with a similar but non-significant trend here at Outlook. So overall, higher nitrogen rates reduce root disease at Scott, but not at the other sites, and early seeding consistently lowered root disease. Next, we looked at the nodulation of all of the plants. We used a rating scale that looked at plant growth and vigor, the color and the number of the nodules, and then the position of those nodules on the roots for a total score ranging from 1 to 13. With a higher number up to 13 indicating very effective nodulation. And you can also find this rating scale with a little bit more detail on the SAS Pulse website. I have the URL here in the corner. So looking at the results here, starting with nitrogen rate again, lower nitrogen rates tended to result in greater nodulation scores. But Swift Current was the only site where this was significant. So we do know that when you supply nitrogen to pulses, they tend to not nodulate as strongly and just rely on the nitrogen that is there in the soil. So this was the case that we were seeing in this trial, but interestingly, it wasn't significant at the other sites, only at Swift Current. For our seed treatment, again, we didn't see a significant response here, but we did kind of see a small trend here where the treated seed resulted in better nodulation scores than the untreated seed, but again, not significantly. And then for our seeding date, early seeding improved nodulation at Outlook and showed a similar but non-significant trend at Scott, whereas we saw the opposite at Swift Current, where greater nodulation actually occurred with the late seeding. So overall, nodulation was reduced with nitrogen fertilizer, but not always significantly so, and the seeding date response varied by site. We also submitted roots to Discovery Seed Labs for identification of disease pathogens. So generally, roots exhibiting disease symptoms can be infected by multiple soil-borne pathogens. So we just wanted to verify which pathogens were causing root disease symptoms that we were seeing in this trial. So we sampled each treatment in the first rep to submit for testing. And we found that all sites had a Phantomyces pathogen present, but not necessarily in all treatments. So at Scott, 92% of the samples that we submitted in that first rep had a Phantomyces pathogen present. At Outlook, this was 75%, and at Swift Current, this was 100%. We also saw varying levels of infection from fusarium species at each site. So you can see those bars here as well. I'd also really like to note that this was a small sample size. Like I said, we only sampled the first rep. And Phantomyces spores can be quite variable throughout the soil, so actual infection rates within plots and across treatments may vary. This essentially just gives us a really good indication that a Phantomyces pathogen was present and infecting roots at each of the sites. And finally, I'd like to go over the yield. So starting with nitrogen rate, lentil yield responded significantly to nitrogen rate at Outlook, but not at Scott, Swift Current, or Redverse. At Outlook, lower nitrogen rates, so our no nitrogen and the 50 pounds per acre, resulted in higher lentil yields than 100 pounds per acre. And this trend was kind of similar across sites, where we were seeing better yields with the no nitrogen or the 50 pounds per acre. And I think this just kind of suggests that applying high rates of nitrogen may not always improve lentil yield, especially if there's other factors that are limiting yield potential. Looking at the response to seed treatment, there was no significant effect at any of the sites. And then looking at seeding date, we had a relatively consistent impact on yield across sites, where early seeding tended to result in greater yields than later seeding. This was significant at Scott and Swift Current, and similar but not quite significant at Outlook. So these results suggest that early seeding combined with low to moderate nitrogen rates may have the greatest potential to improve yields, though responses may vary by site. So overall, some of the key findings from our first year of this trial: higher nitrogen rates and early seeding reduced root disease at most of the sites, but our seed treatment kind of had a minimal impact on disease suppression, as it wasn't always significant at all of the sites. Higher nitrogen rates did reduce nodulation, but this was only significant at Swift Current. And then our low to moderate nitrogen rates produced higher yields than high nitrogen rates, and early seeding quite consistently increased yields. So based on this first year of data, I think we can kind of safely say that moderate nitrogen rates and early seeding show promise for reducing root rot and maximizing yield, but it will be really beneficial to get those next 2 years of data to kind of support and fine-tune these results. So I'd like to acknowledge that we received funding through the Saskatchewan Pulse Growers, and then I'd like to thank our collaborating sites, the Southeast Research Farm, Wheatland Conservation Area, Irrigation Saskatchewan, and Western Applied Research Corporation. I'd also like to quickly note that, like it was said earlier, WARC is going to be hosting the Crop Diagnostics School this year at Scott. It'll be held July 23rd and 24th, so make sure that you guys come out to that. And then our annual Scott Field Day is going to be on July 9th. And with that, I can take any questions.
Awesome. Thank you for the presentation here, Alex. We are really looking forward to heading out to Scott again this year for crop diagnostic school. So
yes.
With that, I'll jump into a few of the questions we have that came in. So first off was, do you see bumping nitrogen rates as a viable strategy for producers to reduce root rot? Did you see the reductions in nodules being an important factor for the final yield?
Yeah, so I guess with the yield response, we did see that highest nitrogen rate, 100 pounds per acre, generally resulting in reduced yields. So I think definitely too much nitrogen is really not beneficial in that case. I think some more lower, maybe moderate rates might be beneficial, but I think having those additional years of research to kind of fine tune those will be really good, because we did kind of see some inconsistent responses to nitrogen rate across the sites this year.
Awesome. And I apologize, I think I missed it, but what was the reasoning behind added nitrogen actually having like an impact on decreasing the disease?
Yeah, so I don't know if nitrogen would necessarily decrease disease, but essentially we wanted to try to add nitrogen to make sure that those plants are really healthy and get a really good start early on in the season, so that they're getting the nitrogen that they need. And then also, if those plants do become diseased and aren't able to form proper nodules, that they might be able to take up the nitrogen that they need as well. I know that sometimes diseased roots also aren't able to take up nitrogen, whether they're nodulating or not, but just making sure that the nitrogen is there to make sure those plants can be healthy and hopefully, I guess, combat some of that disease as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And then the next question is just what seed treatments were you using?
So in this trial in particular, we only looked at Rancona Trio. I know in some of the work that Dr. Chatterton has done, she's looked at quite a few different seed treatment products. I can't list them off the top of my head, but from some of the work that she did, Rancona Trio kind of emerged as one of the more consistent seed treatment options for reducing Aphanomyces disease severity.
Awesome. Alrighty. Well, with that, thank you for presenting here today. We much appreciate it. And we're going to move on to our next presenter. All right. So next up, we have Ashbir Gadebo joining us from Irrigation Saskatchewan, which is the Agri-ARM site located near Outlook, Saskatchewan. And Ashbir is actually just recently started, so we're looking forward to the first presentation we see from him. Good morning. Oh, it just looks like you're on mute there.
Yeah, okay, how about now?
It sounds good.
All right, yeah, I don't see the share screen option.
Okay, we'll just send it back to you here.
Sure, thanks.
Alrighty, I can see your PowerPoint. There we go. Everything looks good.
All right, yeah, if everything is all right, I can go straight to my presentation. So my name is Ashober, and I am the new research director here at Irrigation Saskatchewan. So before I joined Irrigation Saskatchewan, I worked as a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Saskatchewan. And University of Saskatchewan has been my academic institution where I obtained my master's and PhD under the supervisions of Dr. From Wally and Dr. Jim Jermida, currently retired professors, and Professor Chris Yost from University of Regina, currently Vice President of Research. And Professor Chris Yost has been my supervisor during my PhD program and also during my postdoctoral research. So I am using this opportunity today to introduce myself with all of the Agri-ARM team. And so the work I am going to present today is part of my recent research experience before joining Irrigation Saskatchewan. So the title of my presentation is Management of Root Rot Complex in pea and lentils. So in that earlier presentation from Alex, we learned about aphanomyces, but I want to again focus here on the life cycle of the pathogen. And my presentation mainly focuses or makes aphanomyces as the center of the presentation due to the fact that aphanomyces appears to be one of the big player in the complex. So I will start explaining the pathogen life cycle from the point A, and I want to take your attention to the graph side of the screen. So this is a very simplified version of Aphanomyces life cycle, but if you go outside there, you see a different versions of the life cycle. So I will start explaining the pathogen life cycle from point A, which is represent the dormant oospore. So these oospores are long-lived and they can stay in soil for more than 10 years under unfavorable conditions. And so once conditions become favorable, so they germinate into a tube-like structure known as the sporangia. And at the tip of the sporangia, primary oospores are produced. So these primary zoospores, they don't have locomotory structure that helps them move from one microscopic niche to another microscopic niche. So due to a chemical signal from the root exudates of a susceptible crop, such as peas and lentils, these primary zoospores now migrate, germinate into secondary zoospore, a structure described in C. And that secondary zoospore migrate and find the roots of that susceptible crop and establish infection for the first time in the pathogen life cycle. So understanding the pathogen life cycle help us to know the infective stage of the pathogen and also that susceptible stage where we can target if we aim to disrupt the pathogen life cycle and come up with solutions to solutions as controlling agent. It could be like biological, it could be some sort of chemical agent, but in this presentation or in this work, a biological control method was the one that is used, and specifically that method targeted those susceptible stages of the pathogen life cycle. And in this case, the secondary zoospores were the ones that are identified to be the primary infective stage. So once infection is established, these secondary zoospores germinate into mycelia. So now mycelia, because it has a capacity to climb into the healthier portion of the plant system, it starts to feed on those healthy compartments of the plant root. So while doing this mycelogenic infection, this pathogen also produces two opposite mating groups known as Eugonia and Atridia. So in that mycelogenic infection phase, these two opposite mating groups, they produce the dormant oospores. So once nutrients are used up and the plant root decays and breaks open, it releases this dormant oospore, the structure that we saw first in that A, and then this closes the life cycle of the pathogen. So now this dormant oospore can initiate a new disease cycle into that another or adjacent healthy plant, and also they can act as a resting spore for many, many years to come. So these are, as I said, they're very resistant and they can stay in soil for more than 10 years under condition that is not even favorable to the pathogen. So now we understand that this is a pathogen life cycle, but how does the disease symptom look like under plant system? So a phanomycete disease symptom can be classified into two big categories. The first one is a below ground symptom, and the second one is an above ground symptom. So the below ground symptom is characterized by the development of watery soaked honey color lesion in the root tissue. And roots eventually become honey brown or blackish brown in appearance and reduced in size and function. So as the disease progresses, this below ground symptom advances into the aerial parts of the plant, which is characterized by yellowing and wilting of lower leaves, and in some cases, dwarfing, stunting growth, and even days of the entire plant can happen. So in this above ground symptom category, we see in A, yellowing yellowing of lower leaves in lentils. And under field condition, Aphanomyces infected pea plants actually appear as a patch. And this is actually following the water distribution of the landscape. So those areas where water is more likely to sit in the field are prone to Aphanomyces infection. So the plant category C shows how Aphanomyces infected pea plants appear when they are pulled out from the ground. So all of these four group of plants, they have different level of disease symptom, but they have lost all of their root structure. So from a plant that is impacted to this extent, we don't really expect yield. So some reports out there state that loss of productivity from a soil that is infested with Aphanomyces can reach up to 100%. So this is a very destructive pathogen. And the problem actually doesn't end there. Aphanomyces under field condition exist as a complex along with other root rot causing pathogens. For example, the Fusarium pathogens, the Bacterium pathogens, and the Rhizoctonia pathogen, just to mention a few. And this pathogen alone, they cause root rot disease in pea and lentils, and they the destruction level is very significant in some situation. So you can see if this pathogen coexists along with Aphanomyces, which by itself, if it occurs under like as infestation, so it can cause 100% yield reduction. So when it occurs along with this other root rot causing pathogen, you can understand how devastating it would be. So the other challenge with this root rot disease is that Aphanomyces root rot management options are limited. The available ones, such as crop rotation, disease avoidance, and also the use of registered fungicide, they are not providing adequate level of protection. So with this, there is a need to look for other alternative management strategies, one of which is the use of biological control agents. So in my recent study, it was proposed that soil bacteria can be used to interrupt the pathogen life cycle, particularly those life cycles that are infective stage of the pathogen and the secondary zoospores and the mycelia stage of the pathogen. And then they can ultimately help the plant not to develop disease symptom, and there won't be a problem in terms of yield reduction and other agronomic parameters. So the rationale for this study is that in any soil, microorganisms are attracted towards a germinating seed, and there a complex interaction is established between the soil microorganisms and those of the associated microorganisms, with that of the germinating seed. So from the plant to soil microorganisms point of view, some microorganisms end up being pathogenic to the plant, whereas some become beneficial and other microorganisms become commensal, which are not the subject of my today's presentation, but now I will be focusing on the pathogen and the beneficial group of microorganisms. So from the pathogenic microorganisms, we saw those Aphanomyces, the Bacterium species, the Rhizoctonia, the Fusarium species. All of these are grouped under the pathogenic group of microorganisms. And with when it comes to the beneficial microorganisms, within agriculture, we have come across various group of microorganisms. Some are plant growth promoters and affecting the plant in a positive way, directly or indirectly, but some providing disease resistance. And so in this study particularly, we're looking for those soil microorganisms, but particularly the bacterial strains, having a capacity to antagonize the pathogenic group of microorganisms, Aphanomyces, and the other root rot causing pathogens, and ultimately prevent disease symptom in the plant. So with this background and the project rationale, we went out to fields across Saskatchewan and collected soil samples. And from all of these collected soil samples, soil bacteria were screened for antagonistic activity against the root rot causing pathogen. So I want you to focus on the A sides of the plate, which shows inhibition of Aphanomyces. So the left side from the A group shows a fully grown Aphanomyces mycelia, but the one that is next to it shows the interaction plates. So in this method, the bacteria was inoculated at two opposite edges and that soil bacteria. So the Aphanomyces mycelia was inoculated in the center. So the plates were incubated, and after incubation period, the plates were examined for the presence of antagonistic interaction. So as you can see here, there is a clearing zone at the point where the bacteria was inoculated, suggesting that this bacteria and Aphanomyces are incompatible. So the bacteria is producing some kind of chemical that prevents the expansion of the mycelia. This is very interesting. And as I said earlier in that root rot disease complex, this pathogen continue to occur as a complex along with other root rot causing pathogen. And the one that comes in the top list is the Fusarium species. And from that, Fusarium avianacem is the one. And from the Fusarium group, Fusarium avianacem is the deadly pathogen. So this same soil bacteria was evaluated for antagonistic activity against this Fusarium pathogen. So the methodology was the same, and then we see that in that plate where in the B category, we see that the right side of the plate, we see that the inhibition of the mycelia expansion. And this assay, the bacteria was not only inhibited the expansion of the mycelia, but also able to digest some mycelia content of the Fusarium avianacem. So this is very interesting. And one result that I haven't included, the same bacteria was evaluated against Fusarium oxysporum, which is also another root rot complex pathogen. So the result was consistent and appreciable. So this is under laboratory investigation. So the next thing is to take this strain into a plant system where we investigated under controlled growth chamber condition. So in this case, so we took the plant, we took the biocontrol bacteria and inoculated the biocontrol bacteria along with the root rot causing pathogen, including Aphanomyces and the Fusarium pathogens. So I want you to focus on the left side of this screen, which shows the graphical representation of that growth chamber treatment. So the x-axis shows the treatments where plants receiving the biocontrol bacteria and the different root rot complex pathogen. And the negative control indicates that plant groups that are not receiving any of the treatment. And this result is from a P plant treatment. And the positive control is the plant receiving all of the three pathogens. So the plants were grown in a growth chamber condition for 28 days, at which time they were removed from each pots and adhering soil was removed and the roots were washed and root disease data was collected in as a root severity or root discoloration. So this result shows that from the y-axis, we see that by the treatment, the inoculated with the bacteria named LC, and those of the three pathogen showed low level of disease severity. So suggesting that this bacteria is performing disease suppression. Even the suppression is very low to that of like statistically non-significant to that of the negative control. So this is a very interesting result, but the study was conducted in a growth chamber condition, a condition that is highly controlled. So the study was also repeated using lentil as a test crop. So I won't be repeating how this was done, but I want you to focus on the graph side of the screen. So the x-axis again represents the different treatments where we have negative control and positive controls and the different experimental groups. So the LC again here, the graph with a statistical letter B shows a lower disease level compared to all other treatments. So this suggests that the bacteria also produced some level of disease control activity, but the level of efficacy was lower compared to the one we saw in peas. So this is again a very interesting result, but the study was conducted under controlled environment in a growth chamber study. So we again advanced this study into a field-based where we have clearance for the Lysobacter strain and the LC, which and also with for one other additional strain. And we got permissions to take them for a field study from a pest regulatory agency, and then we did a field study. So in this field study, the strains, so this is me doing design and plot layouts. And the study was conducted at various field sites across Saskatchewan. And this is again me doing plot maintenance after plant emergency. So the plants were inoculated with the two bacteria, and in addition to the two promising bacteria, we also included rhizobium strains to see compatibility between this promising bacteria, biocontrol bacteria, and also with that of the commercially available rhizobium. So it's me here again doing a root rot assessment and data collection. And so the root rot data was collected and summarized, and I have it here along with some other agronomic parameters. So again, here I want you to focus on the bottom side of the graph, and specifically to the left side of the screen. So in that, where we see number of pods per plantis, and the y-axis and the x-axis shows the different treatments. LC and LG are the two promising biocontrol bacteria, and R represents the rhizobium inoculant, and control is the one that did not receive any of the treatment. So as we can see here, from all other treatments, the plant receiving the biocontrol bacteria resulted in a high number of pods per plant. This is in P. And again, if we even go one step up and see the plant height, and the same result was obtained. So plants inoculated with this bacteria showed higher plant height. And if we go again to the left side, to the right side of the screen, and where we focus on disease severity, we see again lower level of disease severity in all of the treatment, except in the control where we have the pathogen only. So in that category, again here, the two bacteria were performing really good in terms of disease symptom suppression. So again, if we go up there and the number of nodes, we see a higher number of nodes with plants inoculated with the two bacteria. So across the board, in addition to the disease severity data, these strains were performing really good across the board, including with the agronomic parameter. So this result was using peas as a test crop. And again here, using lentils as a test crop. So we have here disease severity data, plant height, and number of nodes. So again, starting from the bottom side where we have disease severity data. So compared to all other treatments on the x-axis, plants receiving the two bacteria were actually showing low disease severity. That means they have been showing efficacy in terms of controlling disease symptom in the plant, in lentil plant. And again, if we see one step up where we have plant height, so again, plants inoculated with these two bacteria, they were having higher growth. And on the right side of the screen, again, we have number of nodes per plant in the main stem. So we see that plants inoculated with these two bacteria compared to all other treatments, and specifically with that of the control where we have only the pathogen, we see a higher number of nodes. So this suggests that the bacteria is actually performing really, really well in terms of disease suppression and in terms of plant performance with regards to agronomic parameters. So with this, I summarize that there is a potential for biological control of Aphanomyces root rot and the root rot complex caused by Fusarium and Aphanomyces pathogen. So this is all what I have for today in regards to my past research experience. But now I am the research director here at Irrigation Saskatchewan, and I aspire to maintain the existing collaboration with all of the agrarian sites and with all of the collaborators. And I hope we will be having a good research season, and I look forward to that. And with this, I complete my presentation, and I turn the mic to you. And if you have any questions, comments, and suggestions, you are highly welcomed.
Awesome. Thank you for the presentation. It was fantastic. Again, welcome to the Agri-ARM Network. We're really happy to have you out there in Outlook, and we just have a couple questions that came in, so I'll run those by you. So the first one we have here is, can Aphanomyces spores be present in the irrigation water?
Okay, so Aphanomyces is a water-loving pathogen by its nature. So most of the work that I have done was under irrigation system, although there were research conducted under dry land system. So since we say that Aphanomyces is a water-loving pathogen, whenever you have water, and if that water, if that soil has Aphanomyces, there is a chance that that area is going to be conducive for Aphanomyces. But we are in this project, we're trying to find those microorganisms that can adapt at environment where it is also conducive for the pathogen. So for this bacteria or biocontrol agent or even any other treatment to be able to effective in suppressing disease symptom, it has to be able to stay in that environment where it is conducive or conductive for the pathogen. So from the research that I have conducted so far, this bacteria particularly appears to be efficient in staying in that conducive environment.
Perfect. Our next question here is this research with the biocontrols continuing? What are your next steps?
So it is continuing. So we have partners that like private partners that is working with the University of Saskatchewan and also with the University of Regina. So this is at a stage where we say pre-commercialization phase. So the research is actually advancing. So we have the research going on at different sites around Saskatchewan.
Awesome. Next question we have is, I might have missed it during the presentation, but how did you inoculate the plant with the bacteria in the plot trial? Was it as a seed treatment?
No, it wasn't a seed treatment. So this was applied as a liquid treatment. So when we start the experiment, the liquid application appears to be working perfect. So since we were getting consistent result, we stick with that approach. But with what is going on currently, and even before I left that role, seed treatment was also considered as an option to try to see if this application is also providing effective result.
Awesome. Thank you. I believe that is our last question this morning. So thank you for joining us, and looking forward to hopefully seeing you this field season.
All right. Yeah. Thank you. I look forward to that.
Alrighty, so thank you for everyone who is still on the webinar this morning. We were supposed to have one more presenter today, which was Brianne McGinnis from the I'm blanking on the acronym, but NARF, which is the Agri-ARM site located in Melfort, Saskatchewan. Unfortunately, she wasn't able to join us today, but they will be highlighted in our email following to all the attendees. I want to thank you all for attending again today, and what I'm going to do is just pop up our CEU credits for those